Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone, whatever it is, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us for this exciting webinar today. My name is Jonathan Swartz. I'm the Associate Director here at the Zare Institute for Restorative Justice, and I'm excited about today's webinar. Today's webinar is focused on restorative justice and racial healing. Our guests will be Jody Geddes and Tom DeWolf, and they'll be hosted by Demointe Wesley. What we'll do is what we always do for webinars. Our host, myself, will turn it over to Demointe here in a second, and Demointe will introduce the topic and our guest speakers. The guest speakers will have a presentation. So Tom and Jody will have a presentation for us. And then afterwards, Demointe will moderate some questions and answers that come from you all. Then I will come back on for a few announcements at the end, and then we will close. So at this point, I will invite Demointe to the stage here of the studio and invite Demointe to introduce our hosts.
All right. Hello. Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone, to this exciting webinar on restorative justice and racial healing. Very excited for this conversation with our two guests. I'm going to take some time to introduce them. First up, we have Jody Geddes. If we could go back. Yeah. Jody Geddes was born in Jamaica, West Indies, and migrated to the United States at the age of 6. Through her experiences as a Caribbean American immigrant, Jody found herself pushing to have deeper and more intersectional conversations about race, justice, truth, and healing. As a community organizer, writer, and restorative justice healer, Jody seeks to be a home where young people and elders can learn together and create collective community responses to the transformative healing of historical harms built in the legacy and history of slavery. Jody earned an MA in conflict transformation from Eastern Mennonite University, whoop, whoop, and has numerous articles published on mass incarceration and racism. And Jody is a co-author of the Little Book of Racial Healing. Thanks so much for being here, Jody. Next up, we have Tom DeWolf, who has been involved with CTTT, Coming to the Table Talks, since the first gathering at Eastern Mennonite University in January of 2006. Tom is a trained STAR practitioner and has taken classes in restorative justice, transformative theater, media for societal transformation, building restorative organizations, and circle processes at the Summer Peace Building Institute through the Center for Justice and Peace Building at EMU. Tom is the author of Inheriting the Trade, the story of his experiences in making of the Emmy-nominated PBS documentary Traces of the Trade, co-author with Sharon Leslie Morgan of Gather at the Table, and co-author with Jody of the Little Book of Racial Healing. Tom is also a public speaker and workshop facilitator at universities, corporations, and conferences throughout the United States. Welcome, Tom, and thank you for being here. And I guess I should say I'm Demointe Wesley. I'm so excited to be your host. I am a student at the Center for Justice and Peace Building and a volunteer with the Zare Institute. So as Jonathan mentioned, after the presentation by Tom and Jody, there's going to be an opportunity for questions and answers. I'll have some questions, but don't leave it all to me. Please drop your questions and comments in the comment section from whatever platform you're watching from, and we'll make sure to get those answered. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Jody. And Jody may be switching to a computer, so she'll join us as soon as she can. But until then, Tom, take it away.
Wow, welcome. We're going to talk a bit about coming to the table today, but specifically about restorative justice practices that are utilized within the coming to the table approach. I first became familiar with restorative justice when I took my first STAR class back in 2008, and then took an RJ class from Howard Zare. And it just, as with so many people, it changed my life, and my understanding of what justice could mean if it were something that we were actually trying to use to build community, to restore people, to create safe and healthy spaces for people. So with that, what I'd like first for us to do is just take a few moments and just kind of breathe together into this space, to ground ourselves together, and to recognize that at this moment there's no place else that we need to be, to recognize that yesterday's gone, tomorrow's not here, it's not even today, it's just this moment, and to come here with our full selves and to be with each other and to support each other. And so what I would ask is that we take 3 deep breaths in and out together, and just to create that sense of self and community and presence, as Ram Dass so wonderfully taught us, is to be here now. So with that, let's all breathe in to the count of 3, hold our breath for 3, and then we'll let out for 3. So first breathe in, 1, 2, 3, hold it, and breathe out, 2, 3, and again, breathe in, hold, and release. And one more time, breathe in, hold, and release. And with that, welcome everyone. Really glad that everybody's here, and especially you, Jody. Hello. Anything you'd like to add, Jody, as we start?
No, that was perfect. We're flowing like water. It's really great to be here with you all. And while we're presenting, I'm also excited to just be in conversation with you. So I hope that you also see this as a conversation and an opportunity to be stretched by one another, and happy that I get to do this with Tom. So thank you for that breathing opening, Tom.
Thanks, Jody. You'll be able to tell that the two of us really enjoy each other and working together. It's, the universe brought us together somehow, and we share co-manager responsibilities for coming to the table. And so we'll run through these slides just to give you the background on what Coming to the Table is all about. There's the website where you can learn a lot more. There's just a ton of information on the website. It's continually updated, added to, more resources, events, downloadable information, some from clear back when Coming to the Table first began, and some from yesterday. So check out comingtoTheTable.org. Next slide, please. Founded on the campus of Eastern Mennonite University, it was in 2001 that 9 distant relatives, we're talking 7th cousins, very distant relatives, common ancestor, born in 1695, came together to make the film Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north. And it was made in Rhode Island, in Ghana, and in Cuba. And in 2005, Susan Hutchison, who was one of the co-founders of Coming to the Table, and you can see her holding her son there on the lower right image. She and Will Hairston had this image, this dream of a different sort of family reunion when they discovered their linked descendants She, being a descendant of Thomas Jefferson and his white wife, Martha, connected with so many of the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and the woman that he owned, Sally Hemings, who was Martha's half-sister, and Will, with the Hairston family, the largest plantation-owning family in the States. The two of them got connected and started this idea of coming to the table. And so the first gathering was there at Eastern Mennonite University in January of 2006. And our family, Susan, found out about us and invited us to send some representatives. So we were about 5 of the 24 people who attended that first weekend retreat at EMU to talk about what coming to the table would become. And it's the idea of coming to the table, next slide please, is grounded in the I Have a Dream speech, that famous speech of Dr. Martin Luther King, Reverend Martin Luther King. And what he spoke about is, in those red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And that was the dream that Susan and Will and all of their cousins had. And so we got together, and here, this next picture is a photo of everybody who was at that first gathering there at EMU. And you can see a wide range of ages and genders and racial identity. And it was such a powerful weekend. First time I had ever honestly heard the words restorative justice was that weekend, and really powerful. So next slide, please. This is, it was all, started through CJP. The Hairston and the Jefferson folks call themselves the Marthas and the Sallys and the Marthas. And the Hairstons, a group of them, all got together and took STAR as their grounding, strategies for trauma awareness and resilience, as their grounding for understanding what they were all about, what coming to the table could become. Next slide, please. So the vision for coming to the table, it's having a just and truthful society. I'll toss in a little opinion that does not include banning books, does not include shutting down what kind of classes people can take, but a just and truthful society that acknowledges and seeks to heal from the racial wounds of the past, from slavery, and the many forms of racism that it spawned that continue to impact us today. And so what Coming to the Table does is provide leadership, resources, and a supportive environment for everyone who wishes to acknowledge and heal wounds from racism that's grounded in the United States history of slavery and the racism that has been in place ever since. Next slide, please. So this is, Coming to the Table has like 4 legs on this table. These are the 4 legs or the 4 pillars of Coming to the Table. And when we talk about uncovering history, it's just being honest and open about all of it. No need to hide it. In fact, it is unhealthy to hide it. To let us understand what brought us to where we are today, to understand why there remains such disparity today. So really looking at all of history, national history, state history, local history, your community, your church, your school, your business, understanding all of it, and then making connections.
I'll add something to that, Tom, to say a part of that uncovering history is being able to tell the truth, right? And so when we think about even the importance of STAR, there's trauma that people experience as individuals, and there's trauma that people also experience as groups. And that is rooted within this country's history of racism, enslavement, genocide, all of the things that people call the original sins of this nation, right? And the foundation. And what we recognize is that history still exists. And so there's a residue that's left behind. And that's what we're talking about when we say legacy. And so if we don't do the work to be able to uncover that, not just in terms of the systems and structures, it doesn't allow for us to even build relationships and begin to make connections with each other, because there's a lack of telling the truth, right? That how do I engage or begin to create right relationship if there is no truth telling as a part of that practice and process? So I want to be able to also link uncovering history back to trauma, that there is continued perpetuation of trauma within this nation and many other nations across the world, because there's a lack of telling the truth, right? And so there's this idea that there are multiple truths, right? I don't think there's a way that we can clean enslavement and genocide up and make it appear to be a beautiful picture that's painted. We have to tell the truth about the horrific harms, right? The violence that was perpetuated and how it has led to the continued legacy of systems and structures that we have today. And so without telling the truth, we can't move deeper into some of these pillars and begin to build deep relationships. I just wanted to make that connection to the importance of talking about trauma and continuing to center trauma in the work that we do.
Thank you, Jody. I mean, we could do this entire webinar on uncovering history. I mean, it's so much of it is heartbreaking, along with, things that we're certainly proud of in this country, in this world. There's just a whole lot of damage. That second leg of the table of making connections, that's both within and across racial lines. And really the purpose is the building of relationships, honest, accountable, authentic relationships where we listen to and learn from each other and grow together. Working towards healing, this is, by any means necessary. It can be through dialogue, ritual, meditation, reunion, prayer, ceremony, the arts, music, painting, apology, reparation. It's, how do we heal these wounds? And then finally taking actions to dismantle the systems of racial inequality, injustice, and oppression, and to work for transformation of our nation and of our communities.
And I'll acknowledge that some of the ways that we do that organizationally, a part of Tom's and I role, is to really build out training for folks. A lot of times folks are coming to the table from a heart space. And while that is incredibly important, how do we build up the gifts and the skills of folks to be able to then really recognize how they can move towards action, and to also have conversations that have depth and breadth, which we're going to talk a little bit about when it comes to restorative justice. But it's sometimes nice to talk like, this is what happened, right? But we're not separated from the history of this country. So how do we provide the skills for folks to be able to have a full integration that allows them to move towards action, so that we don't continue to repeat the same behaviors and patterns and begin to harm each other?
And so with all of this, at the foundation of coming to the table is STAR, Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. Do you want to go through this part, Jody?
You got it.
Okay. Oh, I thought you meant you got it like you would do it. You meant you got it like you want. Okay, fine.
I trust you.
Oh, how silly. Yeah, so after that first gathering in 2006, which there was an introduction to STAR and RJ and circle process, but it was, in small pieces. And it was in 2008 that I took my first the STAR 1 class, and it just sort of altered everything for me, and met other people that it changed their lives, understanding what trauma is, what trauma does, how it impacts our lives, and really with a focus on, for me, it was on racial healing, and there were several others in the class with that same focus. Later on, I ended up taking STAR 2 a couple of times, actually, and it's been so powerful for me. And our joy, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, Fania Davis, who founded our joy, everything with her is grounded in restorative justice. It changed her life so much, and as a result has changed the lives of so many young people and others in the Oakland area of California. And I won't spend a bunch of time on STAR, other than to say that, through this class, getting the principles, the fundamental pieces of circle process, the importance of this indigenous practice in equalizing a room where you don't have somebody, in charge, and having taken the circle process class taught by Kay Pranis, who wrote the book, the little book of circle processes. It was incredible. And to have that kind of time, here's my plug for SPI classes, is having a week to really dive into these topics is just an extraordinary gift. And to be able to take that class from Kay, it was just unbelievable. So
I would say also, to add to that, Tom, the importance of STAR is to also acknowledge the reality of harm and the reality of trauma. And in our structures and systems, there's often one type of trauma that's valid. And so someone gets into a car accident, it is very easy for people to identify that it's trauma, acknowledge it, right? When we talk about racial healing, racial harm, for particular groups of people and voices that are on the margin, so queer folks, immigrant folks, Black folks, indigenous folks, right? STAR makes things real. It acknowledges what happens to the body when harm is experienced and when harm is passed down. There are many other communities where folks have had that language for a while. And so I think STAR actually opens up even more language access. It's been translated into many, many different languages and it's taught all around the world. And so what does it mean to name the reality of what happens when the body experiences trauma and how that can be passed down in a family, how that can be passed down in a community, how that can be passed down in a group. And it also opens up the room for imagination that transformation is possible, that healing is possible. And I think so many times when it comes to harm, it can often feel like healing is not possible. It can often feel like transformation is not possible. And so for me, at least in my practice, when I'm engaging with folks and when we think about voices on the margins of the margins, for me, also entering into a place not to be like, you're traumatized or your people have experienced trauma, but to think about what is the possibilities for transformation of the body and also of the structural conditions that continue to perpetuate the harm. So trauma doesn't live in a capsule by itself, that there are systems and structures that help to maintain that trauma and to keep people in that cycle of violence that you're seeing behind. Those things don't stand alone and isn't at the fault of the individual that's being impacted. And I think that piece is also important to uphold, particularly when it comes to racial healing and it comes to racial justice.
And on a really practical level, I'm convinced that one of the best titles for a book that has ever been written is The Body Keeps the Score. And the reason for that is understanding that next slide, please, what the cycles of violence, when we recognize these cycles, that the impact is on our physical bodies, this stuff physically, not counting the wounds that are inflicted by other people, physical wounds, it's all of the stuff that goes on inside us when we experience these cycles of violence. And it may be on a societal level, it may be on an individual level, it may be on a small group level, but all this stuff acting in and acting out, it impacts us physically, our physical health and our mental health, our spiritual health. And for us to be healthy people, we need to break free from these cycles of violence. As I'm sure many people listening in today have participated in STAR and understand the cycles of violence and breaking free from those cycles. Would you like to add any more, Jody, to this?
No, I think that sounds good. Just maybe a moment for folks to just take a look at it and think about maybe even your work or anything else that you want to ponder and the spaces that you see this coming up. And when we also think about the racialized society that we live in, right? When we're thinking about restorative justice and racial healing, where are the areas that these things show up? And thinking about the impact of silence, what it means when communities suffer in silence or are pushed to the margins and become invisible. Like what is happening in that cycle, right? If there isn't an opportunity to now break out of it. So I want folks to also look at it and think about that.
And there's one thing I would like to highlight on the next slide. And that is, people that do this work have seen these breaking free, this image of breaking free and how to do it, the acknowledgement, the reconnection. One of the challenges is the very last item, is working, the possibility of reconciliation. And if I get into a fight with my wife, reconciliation is getting back to that place that we know exists, that wonderful, warm, loving relationship that is at the foundation of our marriage. When it comes to the legacy of slavery, there's no healthy relationship to return to. We're not reconciling the descendants of enslavers with the descendants of people who were enslaved because there was a healthy relationship to go back to. It's always been terror. It's always been horror. It's always been abuse. And so really, which is why, when Jody and I wrote our book, the word reconciliation doesn't appear. It's the word transformation, because what we're doing is creating something completely new. So there are times when this snail model and building resilience does involve reconciliation, but really not in the work of coming to the table, other than the concept of reconciling with our best selves, reconciling with that part of our heart and our spirit that knows what healthy relationships are, what a healthy look at history is, what healing really does look like. So that was the thing I wanted to highlight there. And at this point, Jody, I want to turn it over to you for the next slide.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tom. And so I want to talk a little bit about the integration of restorative justice. While preparing for the presentation, decided not to put specific slides in around circle process or around the structural and functional elements of circle, because while that is important, it's important to acknowledge that restorative justice doesn't automatically equate to circle process, right? That so many times we can get stuck today, the way that restorative justice was practiced, right? In just the circle, that I think it doesn't allow for us to recognize how systems also need to be transformed and changed. And so how do I engage with folks in a restorative way where it's not just about shifting when harm has happened, but creating possibility of a relationship that is healthy, a relationship that has depth and breadth, so that if there is a moment where there is conflict, we can come back to each other. And I think it's really important to uphold that. And I think it's also really important to acknowledge and continue to acknowledge the Afrocentric and Indigenous roots of restorative justice, because then if we don't do that, my belief is that we begin to then repeat other systems of harm, right? So when we think about the prison industrial complex and maybe Quakers thinking about rehabilitation, what we now have is a system that commodifies people's bodies, right? And continue to make people invisible. And so anything that is used for good can begin to be used for harm. And so when we think about particularly racial healing and restorative justice, we have to talk about race when it comes to restorative justice. When we get together in a circle, we can't assume that because we're together in circle, it means that hierarchy doesn't exist. We have to do the work to make sure it is equitable. When we enter into space with each other and we might share the same values, it doesn't mean that hierarchy or inequity don't exist in that space. It means that there is work that we have to do. We have to be proactive in that relationship. And so that comes down to our local coming to the table groups, that it is not enough to bring the space of the heart. We now need to be able to support conversations that have depth and breadth, that transform us beyond a coming to the table meeting. And so you might enter into the space one way, and we hope that you are changed and transformed by the space, so that it changes behaviors about how you're engaging with your neighbors, how you're engaging with people in the grocery store, how you're engaging with people in the street, because those are some of the biases that we don't see, because the body has now normalized specific behaviors and specific patterns. And so beginning to look at restorative justice not as something that is reactionary only, but an opportunity for us to be proactive about how we begin to be in relationship with each other. And that doesn't lack truth telling. That for us to be an authentic and deep relationship that has depth and breadth, we also have to begin to tell the truth. And this quote is from Dr. Fania Davis's book that if you don't have it yet, I think that you should get it. It is an incredible read. And it continues to talk about this her own history, where she talks about growing up in Birmingham, Alabama on Birmingham Hill, right? And there's this beautiful way that she makes that connection along with restorative justice, the stories or what she has experienced, right? And how she is continuously balancing what it means to be a warrior and what it means to be a healer. And so the integration of restorative justice that can deal with harm and be a response, right? But how do we begin to build communities and structures and systems that allow us to engage in relationship in ways that are healthy with each other? And I think that's what we need to begin to center, not simply being reactionary from a restorative point, and also making sure that in the restorative justice work, we're continuing to talk about race, we're continuing to talk about bias, we're continuing to talk about how do we begin to create spaces for equity. So in our practice, we don't do to, but we continue to do with. It is not power over, it is power with those that we're building community. And that happens in our circles, and in our spaces with local groups, right? That it is not simply enough to know the history of the country, that our behavior also needs to be transformed. How is there an integration and an application of now what we know to be the truth? And so that's what I would say when it comes to restorative justice, not just simply the circle, but the theory and the practice about how do we be in right relationship with each other. Next slide, please. And so this is probably, I often use this in trainings. And so I want you to actually take a look at this. And I'm going to invite you to write into the chat. I want you to take a look at this, the 7 core principles. And this is brought together from a number of different places, including kind of indigenous practices. This is in the Circle Forward book, if you have that. I'm not asking you to adopt these assumptions, nor are the authors asking you to adopt these assumptions. But these are some of the things that come along with restorative practice, right? I want you to take a look at this, and I want you to think about what is an assumption that is easy for you to lean into. When you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, I believe that. That's my thing, right? And I also then want you to think about what's something that's challenging. And I'm gonna invite you to be real honest here. So what is an assumption that is easy to lean into? And what is an assumption that is challenging? So I want you to take a moment to look at this, and then I want you to drop the number of that assumption. So for example, I believe that human beings are holistic, for example, and I would drop the number 6 in the chat to say that's the assumption that is easy for me to lean into. And maybe I'll say 4 is hard for me to lean into. That's not true, but that's just an example. So I just invite you to take a moment to drop into the chat a number of, first, the assumption that is easy to lean into or easier to lean into, and maybe an assumption that is challenging to lean into. So I invite you to drop that into the chat. I'll give you a moment. Oh, we have a lot of 3s as being easy. Oh, I love that. All human beings have a deep desire to be in a good relationship. Thank you all for that. Number 1 is challenging. The true self is good, wise, and powerful. We have some 5s being challenging. I'm going to give another moment for other folks to drop into the chat. Thank you all for that. It seems like a lot of 3s and 4s are easy for folks to lean into. We have a 6. Thank you all for that. And I encourage you to continue dropping it into the chat and continue to think about it. And I also then want you to think about, how does this show up in your practice, right? Because sometimes, especially for us who are practitioners and might be engaging in this process all the time, we might not really think about how these things show up in our practice, right? That as a facilitator and a holder of space, that I am also an active participant in that space. And so if I'm holding a process, for example, the easiest example, if I'm holding a process and I don't believe that the true self is good and wise, that might impact the way that I see someone's accountability. I might provide judgment that says they're not truly accountable. I don't believe their true self is good and wise. If you've committed this harm, right, I might not believe that your true self is good and wise, right? So, and I don't hold that assumption, but that's just an example that there are sometimes these ways that all of our biases, our assumptions about the world and goodness of people and goodness of ourselves show up in space, right? The same thing that goes into racial healing work at the intersection of restorative justice. And I'm gonna be honest, and Tom knows this, sometimes, or a lot of times, we'll have local groups reach out to us because there's a conflict, right? And folks don't recognize that there's also space for accountability for them, and that can be challenged. They often want us to hold the other person's accountable. And we begin to ask questions about, like, what could you have done differently, as we know in our circle practice. That's hard for folks to think about because they have begun to see themselves as the hero in the story and began to see the other person as the villain. And so even when engaging in a process for repair, a process for reconciliation, a process for transformation, they now have to challenge themselves to not pass judgment on maybe what transparency, vulnerability, and authenticity looks like in that person. So I want you to also think about how not just these assumptions, but your assumptions and biases about people and goodness of people might be showing up in your space. And that is directly linked to our work around racial healing. I think about when I'm often holding harm and healing spaces around racial harm, I have to think about my own biases and how they begin to enter into the space, because then that informs my practice and my ability to create the most safe container and the most brave container. Next slide, please. And so I've talked a little bit about our working groups or our local groups already. So we have a little over 45 local groups. There's been some shifts during the pandemic. Some folks have decided to take a break or really thinking about how to shift their group. And so we have over 45 local groups in over 16 states. All of the local groups function differently because a lot of their work is also not just grounded in the transformation of their own history and relationships, but a lot of their work is also grounded in how do they transform the local communities that they're a part of. And so, for example, the Shenandoah Valley chapter doing a lot of work with the Northeast neighborhood and thinking about the erecting of a historical marker and the renaming of streets, and to also begin to tell the story of the displacement of the Northeast neighborhood in Harrisonburg, Virginia. So if you don't know about that, I'll drop some links in the chat. And so different local groups focus in different areas. There are also some local groups that are really focused on restorative justice. Some of them have joined our grassroots reparations campaign that myself, David Ragland, and others are co-conveners of. And so local groups have an opportunity to begin to have depth and breadth, to have some conversations that take folks through the pillars that we talked about earlier. So really thinking about how they begin to uncover history, either about their family history, but also the history of those local communities, how they begin to lean in with each other and they begin to make connections with each other. And that happens over a long period of time. Some of our strongest groups have been meeting for years. Some of our strongest groups have also become their own nonprofit organizations. And so we've had that with our Richmond, Virginia group and our Triangle chapter group, I believe. And so, you know, that's just to name that there's a lot of opportunity and openness with local groups. But all of this is grounded with what does it mean to uncover the history and to tell the truth about the history of this country and local communities and move towards transformation of community systems and structures, but also the transformation of relationships. We also provide different workshops. And so we provide restorative justice workshops, STAR workshops for folks. I'm right now working on a community organizing one-on-one workshop to help just provide some grounding for folks to think about strategies to grow their local groups in areas of thinking about youth engagement and engagement of people of African descent. Those are just some of the areas that folks are really interested when it comes to the growth of their group. So just working on workshops. Then our national gathering that typically or used to take place on EMU's campus. It is no longer that. We've kind of outgrown that space. No offense to EMU, but we've kind of outgrown that space in many ways with the growth of the organization. And we had our first national gathering actually in Oakland. So our first national gathering away from EMU was in Oakland. It was really beautiful. It was really amazing to be able to host folks here where I'm located in Oakland, California. And our next national gathering will be in Minneapolis. So the desire is to hold national gathering in different cities that are housing local groups. And at the same time, who are also doing a lot of restorative justice and racial healing work. I'm going to pause there and actually pass it over to Tom to talk a little bit about some of our working groups.
Sure. The local groups got started because of 6 women in Seattle decided that, you know, this national group that basically was meeting by email wasn't sufficient. And so they started this idea of local groups. And out of that, the idea of working groups for some people sounds like a temporary thing. It's more, we now consider them more national groups. And like we've got this local affiliate support, which is a group of people that are really just trying to overall look at how Coming to the Table operates, how we can best support individuals and groups and what have you. The most active national group that we have is Linked Descendants. And these are people who are related either by blood or by affinity through the legacy of slavery, through, throughout our history. And people connect with each other, and it can sometimes be a very difficult connection. Other times, surprisingly easy and sweet. And there's a wonderful book called Cousins, written by 2 such people, Phoebe Kilby and Betty Kilby Baldwin. Betty's ancestors were owned by Phoebe's ancestors. And it's, again, called Cousins. And it's just a wonderful story of their getting together. The Linked Descendants, they sponsor writing pods for people writing about their family history. And there's about 10 of those writing pods. They get them started, and then they're on their own to be their own little writing group. They produce the Bittersweet blog. It's called Bittersweet, Linked Through Slavery. And it's all stories about Linked Descendants. And they also focus a lot on the concept of reparations and what does repair look like? What does healing look like? And from actual monetary repair to all the myriad ways that repair can look like. We have a mindfulness working group that, I got to tell you, the first couple of national gatherings that we had, there was some serious conflict, as you can imagine. I mean, it's not just a nonprofit. It's not just, trying to make us feel good. You also throw in race, and it can be really challenging. It was the 3rd national gathering by that time that the mindfulness group got started, that we put in mindfulness practices into the national gathering, where every single presentation began with a small meditation or breathing or just something to ponder as we enter into this next section of the gathering. We did, there were presentations, workshops about various mindfulness practices from meditation to singing bowls, what have you. And it changed the national gatherings when people come from a mindful space and enter into a mindful space. There's just a sense of, respect and calm that comes along with it. And this mindfulness working group hosts a guided meditation on Zoom every month, has been doing so for, 4 or 5 years now, 6 years. And just really powerful. And we have writers written in there. This isn't a group that meets. Those of us, I'm sure there are several writers on this call. We tend to stay home in our pajamas by ourselves. We don't tend to group up as writers. And so this is more of a clearinghouse as opportunities to write come up. We let people know, whether it's, a call from the media or or maybe a book that's looking for people to submit to, or the Bittersweet blog or other blogs, we make that available for writers. So we've had a millennials group. One of the realities of coming to the table is the vast majority are older, people who actually lived through the civil rights movement and can feel the rawness of what took place in so many cities in this country. And so it's been a more of a challenge to get younger people more involved. We've had a millennials group. It's not currently active. Hope it will be again in the future, but always looking for ways to inspire younger people to get involved and carry on this work.
I'll add two more things as well, Tom, is that a lot of our local groups partner with other organizations, so YWCAs, NAACP, Surge Group, and that's often a way to kind of thinking about who's missing from the table and how do we integrate those voices without it being tokenizing, and that's why we try to be so strategic with the trainings that we provide. Another nugget I would like to drop, particularly when it comes to the mindfulness work, is that Angela Davis, there is a video from an interview that she did when she's talking about radical self-care, and she's talking about like what would it look like for folks to be doing yoga and practicing breath work during the civil rights movement. And I think it's important to highlight that because so many times, at least I see that sometimes folks are eager to get to action and conversation, that they might be willing to skip over the check-in and might be willing to skip over the opening. And I think those are the moments that help ground people in the space and build a container for the transformative conversations and experiences. And then we can also look across many, many different practices across the world to think about the use of dance and drumming and movement and breath work as a way to transform, but as a way to also call in revolutionary practices. Like when we think about even theater of the oppressed, right? And how that has led to so many revolutionary practices, or the way that folks are organizing all across the world. When we think about the students on college campuses that are organizing and protesting right now, and how they have been, there's some on different social media and Instagram pages being able to show at the encampments how folks are really doing body and breath work as an act of resistance. I think it's important to also highlight that there is an ancient wisdom when it comes to the practice of breath work, right? And so many times when it is reintroduced to folks, it can be hard for the body to let go. And I remember when we did, particularly the singing bowl, I remember how so many folks talk about the transformative experience, how people felt like they were floating, how it was some of the first time for a lot of people to have the opportunity to be able to close their eyes and to really breathe deeply and to feel safe doing that. And I think there's a lot of power in that, and acknowledging that that is a part of ancestral wisdom practices, that it is not something that once again stands alone. And for me, I'd be remiss if I don't name that there was a large lineage and legacy, and also a body of research. If folks are interested in that, there's definitely a body of research that is also able to speak to that. And for coming to the table, we always want to continue to provide those practices for folks. It's not just the work that we do around kind of the symbolism and the truth telling, but also as folks who are engaging in this work, our bodies are also keeping the score. And so we need to be able to acknowledge that as well. Next slide. Unless you want to add anything, go ahead, Tom.
You know, you remind me, there was a woman who came up to me after that singing bowl session, and she said, I thought that was the stupidest thing that I could ever imagine. And it turned into my favorite part of this entire conference. Just to speak to what you were saying. And yeah, the final slide is just once again the web address, and I guess it would be good to open this. And I'm always so glad to see Susan's picture there on the left of that last slide. Susan, one of our co-founders, passed away several years ago. And she left such a wonderful legacy. She and one of her cousins, Shay Banks Young, Mom Shay, who is one of the Sallys, while Susan is one of the Marthas. You know, they both passed away, but left such a beautiful legacy in the work that they did here at the table. So with that, we can open it up to questions or comments.
Thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for introducing us all, maybe introducing some of us to your incredible work. So like I said, I have a couple of questions that I'll start us off with, but please feel free to drop your questions wherever you're watching from, so that we can keep this conversation going. So something I'm thinking about on the heels of this presentation. So as I mentioned in our little meeting before this, I am from Texas, the often, but maybe not always, great state of Texas, the South, where, the legacy of enslavement is perhaps the most pronounced, right? Of course, we feel it everywhere throughout the United States, but it's perhaps most pronounced in the South. And that's sort of coupled with right now this real urge, this real vested interest in sort of covering over this history, right? Covering over this truth. Tom, you sort of made reference to this as you were presenting, this push to close down DEI offices, to shut down conversations on race and enslavement. And a part of that, I think, part of the logic that is presented on behalf of some white-bodied folks is this notion that, like, well, I didn't own slaves, right? My grandparents and even great-grandparents didn't own slaves. So why am I being made the sort of villain in the story of enslavement? That is what is purportedly felt by some white-bodied people. And so when I think about like restorative justice and even the questions that come from a restorative justice process, right? Like what happened, who is impacted and how, what are their needs? I'm thinking about like, how do those questions, how does a restorative justice process map onto this idea of racial healing? If we were talking about restorative justice processes following, the end of slavery, wherever we put that, it's a little bit clearer, right? To say, who's the impacted party, who is the responsible party. But for some folks, right, it becomes much less clear. Where do we sort of categorize people and how to sort of map a restorative justice process onto this notion of racial healing? So that is my question. If you could take us a little bit deeper into how that works, right? It's much clearer when we say we have this sort of acute instance of racial harm. Someone used a slur or a microaggression. It's easier there. When we're talking about this broader legacy, how does restorative justice sort of map onto this work?
So great, Tom. I see your face. I really appreciate the question. And I think it's one that I feel like I have some responses to. And we're still kind of exploring, right? So a lot of my national work around truth telling and reparations explores that, right? That when we're having truth telling and specifically reparations processes, when we might be in communities where we're not maybe addressing something acute as like busing or desegregation, how we begin to have that conversation. And that's been challenging in some communities. So I think there are two things. One is when I'm working with specific individuals, I'm often challenging folks to investigate like that pain, like that spot that says like that's not me, because there's a truth that is being uncovered that one wants to hide. It's kind of like when you now see something, you can't unsee it, right? So there's that individual work that needs to be done before. Sometimes if it's an ongoing group, right, which I host sometimes these ongoing groups, there's work that people need to be done before they come into the space. That doesn't happen with coming to the table local groups. Kind of anyone can show up. Different local groups have different processes. So some local groups have orientations, right? So it doesn't mean that you come to the group already equipped and having all the knowledge, but we need to be able to orient you to the space because there's going to be some depth and breadth. That pain spot that's telling you that I didn't do that, nor did my ancestors own anyone. That space is going to need to be investigated. So how do we prepare you for the space, right? And then I think when people begin to enter into the space, this is where truth telling comes in, that it can be easy for us to kind of want to coddle people for the goodness of like the cathartic experience of circle. Like we want it to feel good. It is amazing that we can sit together in a circle of brotherhood and sisterhood and all the hoods, right? Like, yes. And here is a practice. Here is a wisdom to throw all of that out the window. Like, let's get to the nitty gritty of it and how as individuals and groups of white-bodied folks, that there are ways in which people have received access to spaces, access to care. The truth telling comes along with that. Access to care, access to live freely. That doesn't dismiss one's particular experience of harm, right? That doesn't dismiss white bodies, folks' particular experiences of living in poverty. And when Black Panthers were organizing up in the Appalachian Mountains, right? And folks began to recognize that their white bodied identity could get them into access to spaces. That meant they stopped organizing with Black folks who were having the very same experiences, right? That also shows up in other movement building spaces. And so I think, as holders of space, we have to push. I like to push folks. I like to stretch folks. We have to push folks and stretch folks to confront the very real ways in which they have benefited from systems and structures who have done harm to particularly bodies of people and who continue to do harm. I think another way to be able to also do this is sometimes there's a lot of work that's focused on talking, and I like to do a lot of work that's focused on like embodiment. So there are a lot of different activities that I do for and once again, it's hard for people to confront the truth, unfortunately, but sometimes that might be some journaling activities, and there's literature that speaks to this. There's journaling activities, there's art activities, there are embodiment activities, and STAR does some of these activities as well. So sometimes I do that because I recognize that if one has walked through the world with a particular story about who they are, and you own that story, that is your identity. And here is a truth, and it shatters all of that. There's an awakening, right? And this happens in coming to the table, right? My first Shenandoah Valley chapter meeting, there was a lot of crying, there was a lot of grieving, and I had to really hold the true reality of someone being in their 70s and having this idea of who they were and the Black woman that took care of them their whole lives, and then to open up a box of going through your parents' things, and there is a new awakening and a new story coming. I can hold that and also say, like, this was bullshit. I mean, BS. I can hold that and also say that this was, a bunch of basura, right? So it's the complexity of the thing where Vanya even talks about the warrior and the healer. I can hold the space for healing, and I can also hold the space for contention. And I think sometimes within circle practice, within restorative conversation, restorative approaches, it is either this cathartic experience of like the opening, we're all warm and fuzzy, or it is the challenge of conflict. And I encourage us, particularly when it comes to racial healing, to recognize the wisdom for the container to hold all of that. I hope that's helpful. I have some other thoughts, particularly when it comes to processes around truth-telling practices and restorative practices. As I'm working with different folks who are trying to have commissions right now and call it restorative commissions, which I think is important, but we must also be vigilant and careful. I don't know if you want to add anything, Tom.
It just from the beginning of what you said that that Texas and the South, that things are more pronounced. And I think part of the challenge is, I live in Oregon. Who thinks of Oregon? But the reality is that, there were sundown towns all over this country. Oregon was a sundown state. I mean, it was in our Constitution when it was passed. The vote when Oregon became a state is, are we going to be a free state or a slave state? And became a free state with, like 75% of the people who voted, which were the white landowning men. And then they had two other items on the ballot, and the free state or the slave state was one. Becoming a state at all was another. The third one: do we allow Black people to live here? And the highest number of no votes were for that article, and that lasted until like the 1930s. That was in the state constitution. So we, as a result, in Oregon, are one of the whitest states in the union, because the legacy of that, the habit that gets developed. And I think that wherever people live in this country and around the world, there are still, because of power structures, money, control, that we end up disenfranchising people who don't look like me in just everywhere. So.
Yeah, thank you so much, both of you. There's a question in the chat from Isaiah who asks, what are your thoughts about how this work can be taught alongside a transformative approach to teaching and learning history as reparations in public schools? Picking up again a bit on that notion that there is a real push in public schools, both K through 12 schools and even colleges, public institutions, to not teach this history. So yeah, any thoughts on how this lives alongside the work that can happen in public schools?
I'll say that it's also happening. I keep looking at you, Tom. I'll say thank you for the question, and I also say that's also happening when it comes to restorative justice. I remember being a student in EMU and doing work in schools. My minor was in education, so doing work in schools, and even in undergrad doing work in schools and doing student teaching. And a school will say we're committed to restorative justice, and it's one teacher doing a circle in their class. And while that is important, that clearly shows that there's a lack of commitment to the work. I think it depends. In colleges, I think there's a lot more opportunity to be creative with your curriculum. I always think that often the admin don't really know what's actually going on in the classroom. And so thinking about the integration, I think, of arts-based practices, and also thinking about, do you have the opportunity to take a risk, right? So that comes into who are the authors that you are inviting into the space to be able to create an opportunity for conversation. I think that's much easier in places like high schools. And I think it's also much easier in like colleges and universities to be able to do that. So thinking about folks like bell hooks, like when I think about organizing, when I think about restorative justice, as much as I appreciate the text from my courses at EMU, I feel like that wisdom was already given to me by folks like Bell, Angela, Fania. That wisdom was built within Black radical tradition already, and I think that's important to uphold and amplify. So thinking about what you have to teach and the integration of that, along with challenging our institutions, I think the integration of arts-based practices are really important. It also is an opportunity to be able to challenge your students to think in a different way. And I think for young people, they really need that. Our young people are really active right now. And I also think it can feel overwhelming to feel like those who have come before me and fought for this, and now we're doing the same thing. And so an integration of those other practices is an opportunity for them to begin to think in a different way. Also thinking about the utilization of films. There are some really creative films that really begin to use animation to be able to talk about history, to also be able to talk about restorative justice. And what I find is that often schools are less likely to push back against animated films because, once again, they don't really know what's going on. They're just, it's like things are coming from the top down to you. And I also think it's important to recognize, this is a nugget, that even in places where books are not being banned, it's still hard to have these conversations because folks are afraid of resistance, right? They're afraid of folks begin to amplify their voices and push back against the status quo. But I think the integration of different arts-based practices and strategies, thinking about how to begin to use films, specifically films that are from an animation standpoint, I think that piece is really important. And a lot of films today are accompanied by a teaching guide. There are a lot of folks who are doing that work at the intersection of restorative justice as well. And also always assessing, do you have the opportunity to push back against the system? I think it's important to acknowledge that all of us can't speak up in the ways that we would like to for our very survival. I think that's important because sometimes we talk about it as if it's something that's easy. And sometimes someone bringing, all about love to a classroom means that they're risking their job to be able to teach their young people about the radical nature of love. So those are just some of the things that I would provide. And you can also send me an email. I dropped my email in the chat, so I can also send some of those resource guides that folks are working on. And working with theater, if there's a theater department on particularly K through 12, if there's a theater department, really working with the theater department to think about how do you, across the disciplines, create a space for that. I've done a lot of theater of the oppressed work, and that's an opportunity to also get young people, even adults, really thinking about like what resistance looks like in a way that is not scary. I mean, when we start talking about abolition, that changes the conversation, but we'll use the language of resistance right now. Tom, is there anything that you want to add? And I hope that was helpful as well, Isaiah.
You know, I the thing that I really appreciate about being alive today is, you know, Jody referenced a number of resources. There is so much that's available now to be used in classrooms. I mean, I'm just really humbled and proud that Jody's in my book is used in high school and college campuses in varieties of places around the country. You know, the Little Book of Racial Healing it's basically a look at the coming to the table approach, an introduction to restorative justice, circle process, trauma awareness, and healing processes. But there's just so much out there now that didn't exist when I was in junior high school and high school. It just, you know, history was much more hidden then. But now it's like I look at my grandmother's hands, and it's like, you know, the body keeps the score plus race. And it's such a powerful way to look at, you know, how the legacy of slavery, racism, injustice, oppression based in race, how it impacts Black bodies and white bodies and police bodies. It's just a brilliant book. And you know, I just finished reading Medgar and Merley, and which is another. It's just heartbreaking what people of color, or what Black people have had to put up with in this country and continue to put up with in this country. There's Coming to the Table offers all sorts of events, and for anybody who's interested, I just added a link to an event coming up on the 23rd of May, which is a screening of the film, a reparations film that the group in Denver is hosting, called The Cost of Inheritance. And it features like 4 or 5 people who are involved with Coming to the Table and the work they are doing on reparations. You know, so the idea of film, of books, of creative arts, and I gotta, you know, just name it, it's a whole lot easier in Oregon. Here we celebrate banned books weeks in our libraries, and they're out on shelves. Read these books that are banned in other places, you know, because that just doesn't happen in Oregon. And I really feel for people who live in Florida and what is being done there by the politicians to, you know, ban books, to shut down classes, to disrupt DEI work. Just really frustrating for this work when people claim what they're claiming, what Christian people are claiming, while what they're doing is, man, I can tell you who Jesus would be throwing out of the temple, but we won't go there. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you both for that response, and Isaiah for the question. Something I'm thinking about along those lines, again, as a Southerner, as a former educator, is something you mentioned, Tom, like in your presentation, this idea that when we're talking about racial healing, the history of enslavement, that what we have to aim for is transformation, not necessarily reconciliation. And so to this question of what I would offer when it comes to public schools is perhaps that even applies there, right? There has to be some ways that we are looking to transform systems and build new things outside of what currently exists. Including schoolings and how we do schoolings. So which sort of brings me to my next question, around how do we move, or how do you all in your work think about this movement from sort of the individual or internal, or transformations even in individual relationships? How do we move from that work to this work that we've talked about around like systems and structures change? When I hear coming to the table, when I hear that idea, that that title, I think about people really coming to do a lot of that internal individual relationship work. Though I'm sure, again, the work moves beyond that. But I'm also thinking about, like, how do we bring the table, to those systems and structures where that are desperately in need of that systems change. So if you could sort of like take us through, how do y'all think about that transformation?
The thing that strikes me is one of the criticisms that Coming to the Table has faced from people from time to time is you're all talk, no action. And you're all about the touchy-feely stuff, and you're not out there marching. There's plenty of people marching. There's plenty of people handing out petitions, and there's plenty of Coming to the Table members doing all of that. The reality is we passed civil rights legislation. We passed voting rights legislation. We passed all of the kind of laws that needed to be in place in order to change everything. Where are we today? I mean, what I look at, the core value, the core work of Coming to the Table is that individual change. Because until we change the hearts and minds of enough people, it doesn't matter how much legislation we pass. We're still going to have the Proud Boys storming the Capitol when somebody tells them to, because they're trying to protect their sense of who they are, which for so many people who look like me, it's the color of my skin. You're trying to take away my power. You're trying to take away my control. You're trying to take away my self-identity. So helping through education, through conversation, through accountability, working with people to truly understand what I am and what I can do, then collectively what follows is that collective work to transform larger systems and structures. But until the hearts and minds of individuals are transformed, the structures cannot be transformed because they're made up of those individuals.
I'll say I was one of those people. One of the reasons I stayed even with Coming to the Table was to be a critic. Tom, most people know this. Like when I came in, I was like, why y'all crying? What have you experienced? What have you gone through? I was very much pushing back. One of the pictures, the second to last slide, showed a former CJP graduate, Fabrice, that actually was the one who convinced me to join Coming to the Table. And he was formerly the president of our board. And so I was one of those people. I was like, oh no. And then I also recognized what Coming to the Table, and I'll speak more directly to your question as well. And I think what Coming to the Table does is provide an entry point for some people that just need to do that grieving, that just need to do that uncovering. People are, not everyone, but many people are kind of coming in green. And it is unfortunate where people get to live in the world where they can be so sheltered by just being white-bodied people that there are things that they never have to pay attention to because it doesn't directly harm them, right? Like there are ways that they can live freely. And that happens to a lot of people who are living in southern communities. But it also happens up north. So I want to be able to acknowledge that piece. And so I think it just provides an entry point for folks. I also want to acknowledge that many local groups are doing a lot of work around taking action that is moving beyond the table, which we've had some conversations about. And so a lot of our local groups are doing the work with EJI around the Remembrance Project. So it's not simply enough for you to be in a meeting room, let's say, having a circle and having conversations and doing group discussions, right? No one else is seeing it, right? Like no one else is being witness to it. And I understand that sacred container, but also for what we're talking about to not be repeated, that behavior, that system, that structure, those biases, those methodologies, it also needs to be shown up in community, right? And so a lot of our local groups are doing that work around the Community Remembrance Project and erecting historical markers and doing ceremonies within the community. And for many of those communities in the South, it's a challenge, right? One of the places, for example, like Abbeville, which is not where we have a local group, but one of my really good friends, Doria D. Johnson, there that passed a few years ago, there's a historical marker that's erected in honor of Anthony Crawford, her great-great-grandfather who was lynched. You can't walk through the community without seeing that reminder of the reality of this community that people uplift and tell one story about, but here is some residue of harm that's left behind, and that it can happen here, right? So when you look at somewhere else and you say that can never happen here, acknowledging that it did happen, and here is the truth about that, right? And so a lot of local groups are erecting historical markers. A lot of local groups are also engaged in reparations work, and so I mentioned before the Grassroots Reparations Campaign, and David Ragland, who is a co-founder of the Truth Telling Project out of St. Louis. And it is really about an approach to racial healing and reparations as something that is moral and something that is spiritual, right? It is a moral commitment. It is a spiritual commitment that we make when we talk about repair. I think there's also spaces where we need to think about practical applications when it comes to money. So if we're talking about reparations that involves money, we need to think about where that money is housed. Evanston is having some of those conversations right now, and many other communities who are looking at Evanston's reparations to think about how do we do that, right? So you cut the check, but who is administering the money? How is the money being taxed, right? Like, is there opportunity in the community for people to grow and increase their wealth, right? Can people now own land? Can they own homes, right? What is that? What are the stipulations of the loan? So I think when we talk about the practical applications, like, okay, this to be true, right? About the GI Bill, about the real estate market and the impact of, kind of housing on Black and brown bodies, right? Like, let's make that visible and also transform those institutions. And many folks in coming to the table are serving as a part of a lot of that work. So serving on things like Maryland's Truth Telling Commission work, right? A lot of local group leaders are a part of that work, where Maryland is really exploring this Truth Telling Commission. And so I think those are the ways specifically folks in coming to the table, local groups are doing the work. Even Phoebe and Betty Kilby in the community that Phoebe's father, the school that Betty's father helped to integrate, think they were exploring, and I don't know if it ended up happening, Tom, changing the name of that school or erecting a historical marker so that folks know the truth about that community, that this story is really warm. And Betty opened her arms to, Phoebe, which she did. She invited Phoebe to dinner without telling the rest of the family. So here comes this white woman showing up to dinner, and it's like, what's going on, right? But they have this warm and deep relationship that isn't just because of it started maybe at this uncovering of this history, but it is so much more about seeing their humanness, and how in the community do we continue to send the reminder of what happened, that there was racial harm that happened here, and what it meant for her father to be one of the first people to integrate the school, and what he had to carry himself. So I just say all of those things to say that there are ways that local group leaders are engaging in that. And I also think, like, to a finite example, there are truth-telling commissions popping up all across the country and the world on some level. And if we don't engage with those truth-telling commissions through a restorative lens that also involves reparations, I think it is easy for it to be something that feels good, right? And even within that, how do we be equitable? What are the voices that need to be heard? And then how do we do the work to find them? That money needs to be invested into truth-telling commissions to find descendants who had to flee those communities. They're no longer there. So you're looking around in the community, and there might be some people who are there, but people had to flee those communities out of a necessity. Invest money into the research, right? And into the work of what happens after someone tells the truth that they have been holding in silence for most of their life, a truth that has been passed down through communities. And there's some examples of that. And so repair should always be a part of our practice and process. Repair, repair, repair. If we don't do it without repair, we're just going to repeat the same thing, right? And also investing money into it. But we also need to shift our financial systems and structures the same ways that we talk about shifting communities when we look at things like housing and we look at access to equitable education. I hope that's helpful. I have other examples and ideas, but my mind is racing. This is making me super excited. But thank you for the question again.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of your answers, and for all that you've offered us over this time. We have about 10 minutes left, but I really want to save some time for you both to have final comments, and then Jonathan is going to join us at the end for some last minute announcements. So if there are any questions that you all have or that didn't get answered, I hope I can do this. I encourage you to reach out to Jody and Tom, and I'm sure they can get back to you in their capacity, and look into the work of coming to the table. But yeah, before we go, I just want to turn it back to you, Jody and Tom. Any last minute comments, bits of wisdom that you want to leave folks with before we walk away?
I'll go. Maybe this is the brief I might be. Let's see. Um, yeah, I'll say one of the things I want to say, and Demonte, you had mentioned this earlier around transformation. That was probably the hardest chapter to write, and it's a chapter that I proposed. Um, Tom and I had some different ideas about how that chapter would initially go. We do have a webinar about the book that I think we mentioned it in, but I'm still thinking about what transformation means and still thinking about transformation looks like as someone who is literally doing this work every single day. Like, I'm about to go into juvenile hall in about 2 hours, to do some credit messenger work. And so I'm constantly engaging with it and constantly thinking about it. And that's a space I encourage us to lean into because it is where dreaming can happen. I'm often asking folks, what does a world without prisons look like? What was a world without racism look like? Genocide, war, displacement that is legalized, right? Let's really dream about it. I think sometimes as someone who's an abolitionist, I've found it easy to talk about what I want to dismantle, but what do we want to build up in people and in systems and structures? And so I encourage all of us to move towards a place of transformation. And it doesn't mean we're ignoring what is happening, but I want to always create space for dreaming. And it's also healthy for me. I think about moments I was just so mad as hell and fed up with the system and fed up with the world that there was a physical attack on my body that everything felt debilitating, but I had to keep moving forward because my ancestors required me to do that. But I also believe that they want wellness for me. I believe that Queen Nani and all my ancestors want wellness for me. And so I'm constantly reminding myself to move to a place of transformation that involves dreaming. And I also have a kid. I'm named that because that's a huge part of my racial healing journey, that for my daughter, for there to be a space where she's able to dream and I don't put on her what has been passed down to me, that she doesn't have to carry the load of having to maybe always choose between being the warrior and the healer, because growing up in Oakland, she might not experience any of the things I experienced. So say all that to say, I encourage us all to move towards a place of dreaming. And that doesn't mean ignoring what is, but to think about what is to come and what I believe is truly possible for ourselves and for our world. Tom?
Wow. I feel like anyway, I'm really honored that Jody and I were asked to be here today. It really means a lot. And Jody put an email address in the chat, and I just put our office address in the chat. So, feel free to reach out to us with any additional questions or what have you. And one of the two of us can respond. I just, I remember growing up in Southern California during the time of the Watts riots. And I was just a scared little white kid all the time. There was police in full riot gear on my junior high school campus every day. And where I got my education about this was from that experience and from reading like Eldridge Cleaver and Dick Gregory in junior high school. And so I try to do that now with my grandchildren, to let them experience, to read books about like Jackie Robinson. They know that I'm a big baseball fan, and Jackie Robinson, it really means a lot to me. And so talking with my grandchildren, it's like planting those seeds. And that's it. I think so much of this work for us is Johnny Appleseed kind of work, is continuing to plant the seeds, knowing that some of those seeds may never grow or may not grow for a season or two and then will grow, or may grow right away, but to do the work, to be present and to continue to understand the importance of this work. The most important word in restorative justice is restorative. Is we're trying to be in a place where we're recognizing each other's humanity, our interconnection, and the shared glory, if you will, of this transformation into a much more healed and supportive and compassionate place. So thank you for being here.
Yeah. Again, thank you both so much. And thank you all who were able to join us, or if you're watching the recording, thank you for taking the time. Thank you to Jonathan and the Zaire Institute for allowing me to host. Jonathan, I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jody, Tom, and Demointe for this time. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us today. This is our final webinar for this 2023-2024 season, and so we are looking forward to starting another season coming up in September. And so September will be focusing on restorative justice and the arts, community healing through creativity, with our guests Naomi Shaloub, Malachi Scott, Raki Holman, and Kamoya Johnson. And looking forward to having Tarek Mazarani as our host for that webinar on September 18th. And as always, feel free to visit our website in order to find updates of things that we're doing, things that we have done, webinars coming up, as well as an archive of all of the webinars that the Zaire Institute has done since, I think, 2011 was our first webinar. And additionally, we're always accepting and desiring your ideas for topics, and would also accept donations to continue this work of providing connections and resources for folks interested in restorative justice. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time.